Hey everybody! In the previous video, we covered creating most of the textures and UV unwrapping and mapping our model. In this video, we're gonna cover how we're going to create the materials and shaders and have a little bit of a look dev process. Hope you enjoy! The first thing I'm going to do is just get rid of any kind of objects that are left from the modeling and the UV unwrapping phase, and I'm going to create a plane and make it into a backdrop. So let's get the cursor into the world origin and then get our plane in the middle. I'm going to stretch this a little bit and start creating a backplate for our renderings. The reason why I'm doing this is when you're rendering something like glass or something that is liquid, you actually need something that is behind the object. That way you give a little bit of information to be refracted from our refractive objects. That way we'll have a better representation of the material. Okay, for this backplate I'll just shade it smooth and I'll give it a new material, and I'll just make sure that it's somewhere in the gray area. You can get rid of the specular too, it doesn't really matter. Now, for the look dev, I will be using the built-in HDRI textures in Blender. I usually don't use anything outside of them. The main idea here, the main goal, is that once we create our model, it should look fairly accurate regardless of which HDRI we are using. So I will start with the interior one, and the first thing that I'm noticing is that I'm still using the default color management for Blender. So let's go into render settings, go into color management, and in the view transform from standard, let's switch to filmic. Of course, if you have things like AGX, or maybe you're using ASUS, you can go with that. For this video, I'll just stick with filmic. And from the looks, we can go with medium contrast, as it will make the final look a little bit more realistic. One thing that I also want to do is go into view and make sure that my focal length is something like 80 or 90, which is a bit closer to the camera that I'm going to use in the final rendering. Okay, now we can get rid of the UV space. So let's join those areas and we can work only on the shaders. I'll start with the first very easy ones, which is the bottle cap and the sticker. So right now we have only a bump texture. I'm going to create a bump node, plug the texture into the height and that into the normal. Okay, at the moment this is a bit harsh and most people usually just go with the strength, but this isn't a fairly accurate way to recreate the bump information. What I would suggest is go with the distance. That way you will still have all the detail coming from your bump texture, but it will be compressed, as in the brightest and the darkest pixels will represent a much smaller difference between the highest and the lowest points of the bump. So let's go with something like 0.001, so this is 1 millimeter and this is still too much. Maybe add another 0. Okay, that's looking a lot better. And I know in the original this bottle cap was actually made of wood and you could see the wood grain and the wood coloring, but for my image I just want to keep it into I want to give it a dark painted look instead of seeing the actual wood grain. So usually we don't touch the specular, but we can play with the roughness. And okay, this is starting to shape a little bit better. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get a nice highlight coming off of the smoother areas in this render, and when I'm playing with the roughness, you can see that the bottle cap is still a little bit too bumpy. So let's go back into the bump and reduce this, let's say by half. And okay, that's starting to look a little better, maybe just a little bit more. Yeah, okay, that's good. Now we can bring back the roughness a little bit to make it look more like wood. Yeah, that's a lot better. Okay, now keep in mind when you're in the look development phase and you're creating shaders, there's a lot of back and forth. So you'll be playing a lot with things like bump and roughness, and keep in mind that the more bump you have, usually this will add roughness to the overall look of the shader. So it will always be a balance between the two. Okay, now we're getting to something that I like, and it looks more like painted wood, so we can move on to the sticker. And at the moment I'm going to place very rough shaders, and after that, after we've set up some lighting, we maybe would need to further tweak them and refine them so that they look good in the lighting that we have, rather than leaving them as they were by default. Okay, so for the sticker shader, I want a rather shiny surface, and I'm going to use a noise as a bump. So let's bring in a noise texture, add mapping coordinates to that, and bring in a bump node. Great, so let's take the factorial and set it into height again, and set this into the normal. Now there's a problem, as you can see, with the mapping. What we need to do is go from generated to using either UV, because we have good UVs, or use object. And as you can see now, the size is way too big. I'm looking for a very small scale. So let's go with, let's say, 800. And I don't want any detail, and I don't want any roughness. Now this needs to be a lot more. Okay, and now we can bring back the distance again, even more. Actually, even more. This is still way too bumpy. Hang on. Okay, this looks a little better. I'm gonna bring back some roughness so that we get a little bit of micro detail. Maybe bring back the detail into the noise texture a bit. Okay, great. Now I'm gonna call this done for now. I really don't wanna put more effort into it, and we can take care of the glass. We already have this placement set, and to get a good glass shader, we need to set the base color to white, like pure white. Get rid of the roughness. Now this is really important. Let me show you why. Because once we introduce transmission, and we give it a second to render, you will see that the surface still looks very rough, and that's because we have a lot of roughness in the reflections. So let's get rid of that, give it a second to update the mesh. Of course, when we have displacement, pretty much every time when we are doing something with the shader, it will affect the render time. So every time we make a change, it will recalculate the shape of the displacement, and that's gonna take some time. So for that particular material, I will skip the displacement for now. I will do any kind of tweaks that I want without playing with the displacement, and then I'll add it back into the whole mix. Now, one thing that we should know is that when you're recreating refractive materials, you need to take care of the IOR. Basically, the IOR tells you how light is refracted to the object, and how much of it goes through it, how much of it is reflected, and at what angle. You can look for accurate IOR values for pretty much any material on the internet. One thing that I know is for glass it's 1.57, so we'll stick with that. And then I want to select the mesh that we had for our whiskey. So it's plane 2. Let me rename it. So we are renaming it for convenience. and I'm going to start working on that. So we have the whiskey liquid. Right now there is no material, so let's create a new one. Keep in mind you can create materials either from the material section, click new here, or if you're in the material shader editor, you can just click new here. Okay, the whiskey will be pretty much the same. Get rid of the roughness, base color of white, introduce transmission, and the IOR will be 1.32 as far as I remember. Basically, whiskey and most liquids have a value of IOR of around 1.3. Now, to make it look more like whiskey, we can do a few things. The easiest one is to take the base color and just introduce some red. And we need to bring down the values. Okay, it's gonna take some time to nail the color that we're going for, but keep in mind the way that we're going to achieve the look of that whiskey is going to be through what's being refracted through that bottle. So it doesn't really matter that much what we do now with the shader. We just need to make it look sort of like the liquid we're going for. So from here, let's just play a little bit with the values, maybe something a little brighter and a bit more saturated would look a lot better. Yeah, that looks much better. And the last thing that we're left to do is create the shader for our leather strap. Now for that we need to create a few textures, and here I'll give you a quick walkthrough on how to create shaders, or actually how to create textures out of images that you found on the internet. So let me just load in one image. This is a leather texture, an image that I found on the internet, and here we're going to take a look at how we can create a actual useful PBR texture from this. Now the first thing that I want to do is to crop it into a rectangle. So I'll take the crop tool and make sure I select a rectangle out of it. One thing that I'm taking into account when cropping is I'll try to crop out the areas that are undesirable, so areas with strong highlights, strong discoloration, or a lot of contrast. So let's crop that from image, come on, crop to selection, and we have a start. The next thing that I want to do is go into filters, map, and I'll use the tile seamless filter. But in case you don't have that, here's how you can do it. For example, if you're working in Photoshop, just offset the image by half, take your healing brush tool and select somewhere where there is a more homogeneous color, and just start painting over the seams of your image. One thing that you can do is select a softer brush, and that way the transition would be a lot smoother once you paint it in. Now, of course, I'm not gonna go through the whole process of doing that. I will rely on the simple filter that's already built into GIMP. So let's tile seamless, okay. And the next thing we want to do is we want to get rid of the highlights, and we want to get rid of the color variations that we're getting. So for that, I'll duplicate the layer. I will completely desaturate it. So from color, you can go into saturation, get rid of that. And I'll set this layer into luminance mode. So the blending mode will be set to luminance, and I will go into filters, enhance, and I will select high pass. Now we need to play with the strength and contrast. This will start to get rid of the color differences and the and the lighting differences. As you can see, it's bringing closer the bright parts to the light parts. And one thing that you can take into account is adding more standard deviation. You will get an image that looks a lot more closer to the original, rather than when you're having a lower standard deviation where the differences are much more suppressed. So I will go with something in the middle and hit OK. Great. Now we need to get rid of the highlights. So let's flatten that. And for this, I will take my color picker. I will select to sample average and set a rather large radius. Get the color that I want. Create a new layer and just fill it with paint with a solid color. And from here, let's set it to darken only. Of course, this kind of looks weird now, but if we play with the opacity, and also if we play with the brightness, let's just bring back the opacity to maximum, and from here go into colors and brightness. Come on, brightness and contrast. If we play with the brightness, we can tell exactly which areas we want to affect. Okay, we're getting a much better result, although we're still seeing some highlights. Let's just try to clump them a little bit. Okay, that looks a little bit better. The next thing I want to do with this texture is actually match the colors of the original. So we'll go back into colors, brightness and contrast, and this needs to be a lot darker for the image that we're going for the material that we're going for. Okay, good. Now we need to get a bump texture out of this. So let's go with saturation 0. As you know, bump textures are actually black and white. So colors, get rid of the saturation, and most people will go with that for a bump texture, but that really isn't that effective, that really isn't that accurate. What I would suggest is go into filters again, and again use the high pass filter. As you can see, the high pass filter kind of figures out where there are edges or there are sharp transitions in our image, and that way we can better determine the crevices and the heights in the bump of our material. So we need a lot more contrast. And we need to play with the standard deviation. So I'm trying to get a more homogeneous texture rather than have all of the detail come through the image. So I'll stick with something lower. And one thing that I'm noticing is that everything at the moment the texture is inverted, so things that should be a crevice, should be a valley in the surface, are actually bright. So let's just take into colors and just invert everything. Great, now we have a more accurate bump texture. So let's export that and call it something that we will remember. Leather bump, for example. Export it. Just make sure that the quality is set to 100% so that we don't have any clumping of the color or any kind of JPEG artifacts. And let's export the diffuse also. Great. Now we can continue building the roses material. Again, I don't want the displacement to come through while I'm working on that, so let's get rid of that. And from here we can load in our textures. So we have our leather diffuse. We already have UV, so this will fairly match what we're going for pretty well. But if you remember, once we were making the UVs, we kind of squished them together, so at the moment they're stretched out. So what I want to do is either add a second UV channel, and that's what I'm going to do. So go into the object data properties, add another UV channel, and in the second UV channel I'll just squish everything by 0.5 again. Great. Now, as you can see, there wasn't really any change in our render view, so we can go back into the shader editor, and from here let's delete the texture coordinate and bring in a UV map coordinate, plug that into the vector and select our UV map 1. Great. Now everything is styled correctly, so there isn't any stretching in the texture, and we can fix the tiling. Great. Okay, a value of 4 seems to work fine. From here I'm going to hit Ctrl+Shift+D, which will duplicate my texture, but it will also keep the connections before it. So let's load in the bump texture and set it to non-color data, add a bump node that we plug into the normal, and we need to bring in the distance a lot down. Okay, this is looking pretty good. Usually leather is very rough, so we can just slightly lower the roughness to make it a little bit more shiny. And keep in mind, we're going to mix two different leathers. So if we take a look at our reference here, and just bring that up, if you look at the reference, we have a texture that is a little bit more shiny and darker, and we have a bright one which is a lot more rougher. And I'm going to do that right now. I already have prepared some textures for that, so let's just duplicate that material, and we're going to plug it into the surface so that we see what we're doing. And I'm going to load the textures for that. I have prepared them in the same way. So we have rough leather diffuse, and we have a rough leather bump. Again, just make sure we are using actually non-color data for the bump, and I think I want a little bit more timing for that. Yeah, that looks better. Okay, and I actually want to make it rougher, so bring the roughness up and actually bring the distance up. This will also change the overall feel of the texture. Great. Now in order to mix them, we're just going to use our displacement texture. So let's create a mix node, but a mix shader node, plug in the two, and from our displacement texture use it as a mix. Okay, so what we're getting now is the darker texture is actually on the top of the surface. So the darker texture is on the wrong side of the geometry, so we need to switch the two materials basically. Just like that. Okay, and we can bring back the displacement. Okay, that looks a lot better now. And one thing that I'm going to do is just bring back some more bump here and tile this texture a little bit more, as it still doesn't look right. Okay, here's another thing that I'm noticing, and that is that there is a slight we can see the scene here in our object, and the reason for that is our geometry isn't very well spaced out and we're getting a bit of stretching. So in order to fix that, I'm going to use, instead of UV mapping, I'll just use triplanar mapping. So let's get rid of that. Add a texture coordinate node and use the object input. Then, instead of using the flat projection method, we're going to switch to box on both our textures. So on both the rough leather diffuse and the rough leather bump, and we're going to play with the blend, I'm sorry. So let's bring in some blend so that on the angles things are blending smoothly. And we can take the scale and bring it a little bit more. Of course, the scale will be different for this shader for the simple reason that the texture coordinate went from UVs to object, and those are a bit different. Okay, one thing that I'm noticing is that this material is still way too shiny, so let's take care of that and bring in a lot more roughness in here. Of course, if it's still not looking the way it should be, I'll just get rid of the specular completely, because in the reference that part of the model really wasn't reflecting that much light. Okay, now we are almost done. One thing that I like to do is I just want to add a little bit more contrast between the two textures. So let's add a hue saturation node in between our diffuse textures, and I'll use that to control the overall appearance of the shader. So for the one that's on the inside, I want to make it darker. So let's just bring the value down a little bit. And usually I don't bother with precise numbers here, I just try to make it look correct in the viewport. And for the color correction of the other, I'll just make it slightly brighter. And maybe I'll need to desaturate it, because when you're brightening something, usually the saturation of that color will go down. So let's lower that a little bit too. And with that, we have all of our materials complete. One thing that I want to add is actually just make that label a little bit more interesting, and I'll just turn it to the side slightly. What I'm aiming for is that I want to be able to see some of its shape. So I'm looking to be able to see the name, the print of the roses, and that little latch that we modeled, because it's actually adding a more interesting silhouette to our render. And great, in the next video we'll take care of the lighting. Thanks for watching, and of course subscribe for more videos.